Welcome to the first episode of Dre's Crime Chronicles, where we unravel the darkest and most twisted crimes to understand the people behind them and the lasting impact of their actions. I'm Dre. Today we're diving into the story of a man whose crimes went unnoticed for years, a man whose violent legacy spanned decades before he was finally caught. Tony Alvin Ables may not be a name you know well, but his story is one that reveals a chilling glimpse into how some killers can slip through the cracks of justice. Today, we're going to explore what led him down this dark path, the lives he destroyed, and how he managed to avoid capture for so long. Before Tony Alvin Ables became a name whispered in the darkest corners of Florida's crime history, he was just a boy, Clyde Ables, a violin-playing kid with a friendly demeanor, outgoing, talented, but hiding a world of pain beneath the surface. Born into a home filled with violence and chaos, Tony was the youngest of 8 children. His father, Clyde Ables, was a construction worker known for his hard work but also his temper. He was abusive and violent towards Tony's mother, who remained unnamed in many reports, a woman who finally fled the home in the early 1960s, leaving behind a fractured family. Tony, just a 13-year-old, began to drift both literally and emotionally. He had run away for months at a time, his only companion, the violin. He played with surprising skill, but there were no friends, no real guidance, just a growing seed of abandonment that would soon turn into hatred for the world around him. Society had failed him, and in return, he would turn his back on society. By 1970, at just 15, Tony took his first life. A middle-aged man whose name has been lost to history was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Some reports claim Tony shot him point blank in the head. Others say the man was stabbed or shot in the chest. What we do know is that the crime was brutal, cold, and committed by a boy barely old enough to understand the consequences. The crime left shockwaves in the community, and by March of 1971, Tony pled guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison at just 16 years old, but due to his age, he served only 12 years before being released. After his release, Tony followed his father's footsteps, becoming a construction worker. But the years in prison did little to quell the darkness inside him. It would only be a matter of time before Tony Ables found himself on a path to violence once again, leaving behind a trail of broken lives in his wake. After years of struggling to find his place in society, abandonment, trauma, and criminal past shaped his path. Tony Alvin Ables' violent tendencies escalated to their deadliest point on June 4th, 1990. He was living in St. Petersburg, Florida at the time, when an argument with his girlfriend, Marlene Burns, turned deadly. Tony accused Marlene of cheating. For over an hour, the argument spiraled into rage. Witnesses later recalled how they heard shouting and saw Marlene trying to calm him down. But Tony wasn't calming down. In a fit of fury, he pushed her down a flight of stairs, and in a frenzy, he followed her. He beat her and stomped her with such ferocity that by the time police examined her body, they found 29 rib fractures and multiple head injuries. The brutal beating left her lifeless. Witnesses reported seeing Tony trying to wipe the blood from his hands while holding a blunt object, likely the very weapon used in the murder. At around 11:30 a.m., one neighbor had already called the authorities. When police arrived, they found Tony at the scene, covered in blood, still in the throes of trying to hide what he had done. He was arrested on the spot and charged with first-degree murder and taken to the Pinellas County Jail. In June of 1990, Tony Alvin Ables was convicted of Marlene Burns' murder. The sentence was clear: death by electrocution, but that wasn't the end of the story. Just 2 years later, in 1992, his sentence was commuted to life in prison due to his mental health problems. A judge named Bob Barker, with evidence from psychiatric evaluations and testimonies from Tony's own brother, Anthony Ables, made the ruling. Anthony spoke about the years of trauma they endured as children, the absent mother, the abusive father, and how these experiences had deeply affected them both, causing mass trauma and neglection issues. After the brutal murder of Marlene Burns, his story didn't end there. As investigators dug deeper, new horrors came to light. What they uncovered was a cold trail of forgotten victims and 2 women whose lives were cruelly stolen. In 1983, 4 years before Marlene's murder, a frail 83-year-old woman named Adeline McLaughlin had moved to St. Petersburg from New York. She lived on the first floor of the Ten Eyck Hotel, a downtown retirement residence that overlooked Mirror Lake. Adeline was a quiet, polite woman described by her neighbors as a stylish yet reserved. She didn't gossip, didn't stir up trouble. She was simply a woman enjoying her quiet retirement by the water, often sitting on a veranda, just watching the lake. But on June 25th, 1983, that peaceful life came to an abrupt and violent end. Adeline was awakened in the night by the sound of her window being smashed. Standing in her bedroom was an intruder, grinning menacingly as he grabbed a pillow and suffocated her. She was too frail to fight back against his strength. He ransacked her apartment, stealing whatever he could find, leaving her lifeless body behind. It wasn't until 8:15 a.m. the hotel management discovered her during a routine check. The entire apartment had been burglarized, and there were no clear leads. The case went cold for over 23 years. Then there was Deborah Kaiser. Unlike Adeline, little was known about Deborah's life. She was born in 1955. She graduated from Clearwater High School in 1973 and spent time living in a mental hospital in St. Petersburg. Her life ended tragically on Valentine's Day in 1987 when a passerby discovered her body near Roser Park Bridge. She had been dead for roughly 12 hours. She was found half clothed, bruised, and had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Through DNA evidence that was recovered, Deborah's case went cold for 19 years. Her family waited for answers. It wasn't until 2006 that St. Petersburg homicide detectives decided to revisit these old cases. They sent DNA samples from both Adeline's and Deborah Kaiser's crime scenes to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. What came back was a shocking discovery. Tony Alvin Ables' DNA matched both crime scenes. Finally, after a decade of investigations, had tied him to these murders. But even with this new evidence, justice for Deborah Kaiser would remain elusive. Authorities chose not to pursue charges for her murder, citing the complexity of the case and the fact that Tony and Deborah had been romantically involved at this time. Though the case was officially closed, Deborah's family finally had some form of closure, even if her killer was never formally convicted. For Adeline McLaughlin, however, this case was different. Tony Ables was officially booked for her murder. While he has yet to be charged, police are certain that this frail elderly woman fell victim to the same man who had terrorized so many others. The case of Tony Alvin Ables reveals just how deep his violent legacy runs. From the streets of St. Petersburg to the forgotten rooms of retirement homes in a dark city past. How many more lives did he destroy? How many other cases might still be waiting for answers? His story reminds us that even when killers are caught, their true horrors may remain hidden for years. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Dre's Crime Chronicles. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the dark and twisted life of Tony Alvin Ables. Your support and curiosity are what make this podcast possible, and I'm truly grateful that you've taken the time to listen. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have a moment, please leave a review or share the podcast with fellow true crime fans. It helps the show grow and reach more people like you, are fascinated by these dark stories. I would also like to give a big shout out to Twisted Minds documentary. They filled in a lot of the gaps that I just couldn't find online. And I just want to thank you again for bearing with me. This is the first episode. Trying to get everything locked in. Thank you again. Peace.